Today, we'll be discussing the case of Zholia Alemi. Zholia was a woman of big aspirations. After graduating from college, she went on to pursue a degree to achieve her goal of becoming a doctor. She enrolled in school to get started with her medical studies. And after a few years, Zholia went on to become the physician that she had always dreamed of becoming. She quickly was able to find her first position as a practicing psychiatrist, and she would travel to multiple places around the UK practicing her work. But while it seemed that Zolia was just your everyday psychiatrist working at hospitals with a variety of patients, there was one major problem with everything Zolia was doing regarding her practice. Zolia was hiding a very big secret. Because what many didn't know, not her patients, not her colleagues, not even the medical boards, nobody knew that Zolia was not a licensed physician at all. She never was trained or certified to become a physician. In fact, she never got through medical school, yet alone made it halfway through her program there. Zolia went on to not only treat, but medicate and detain hundreds of patients. And she would do this all with no medical degree. For over 23 years, somehow, someway, Zolia was able to remain undetected, but fortunately for her patients and the general population, Zolia would actually make one crucial mistake that would soon foil her heinous fraudulent scheme. All because her increasing greed would soon open the eyes of many to what she had done. But before we get into this case, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel, I post anything medical mysteries and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. But before we get into this case, I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, Factor. Okay, so one of my biggest struggles trying to balance school with cancer and everything else has been trying to get fresh meals regularly to ensure I'm fueling my body. Especially when I'm deep into treatment or deep into the semester, it's an honest struggle sometimes to scrape a decent meal up together. That's why I was extremely excited when Factor reached out to sponsor my video. Factor makes ready-to-eat, chef-crafted, and dietitian-approved meals, which honestly just makes it easier to have tasty and fresh meals ready within such a quick amount of time. It took me 2 minutes to heat this up versus the hour it would have probably took me to prep, cook, clean up a usual meal. I also really like that they're flexible, so you're able to change up your meal plan or change the schedule for deliveries if need be, which is definitely a must for me with how often my schedule changes. Please be sure to head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code PETAL50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code PETAL50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. Thank you, Factor, for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get into this case. Zholia Alemi was born on December 23, 1962 in Iran. At some point, Zholia moved to New Zealand, and it was there where she lived and studied for years before she moved to the UK. All in all, personal information wasn't so easy to find for her, which we'll be discussing later, as this privacy easily played a huge role in this case. What is known for sure is that in 1995, an electoral register had her down for the Epsom region of New Zealand with the occupation of student. So she was definitely in her studies there at the time. In 1988, Zholia began attending the University of Auckland in Auckland, New Zealand. It was there where she studied human biology, and she ended up graduating with that degree in 1992. With this interest Zholia appeared to have in the human body, it was no surprise that she then went on to attempt a new degree, but this time in medicine. After graduating, Zholia began studying to achieve a degree called a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery, or MBCHB degree. An MBCHB degree is a medical degree granted by medical schools in the UK. It's typically a 5 to 6 year program, and it's a standard degree in many countries for those looking to practice medicine. Now, although Zholia had been able to successfully finish her first degree in human biology, this new degree path was unfortunately proving very difficult for her. Zholia successfully got through that first year, and she ended up passing her first year exams. While she did make it through the second year, her situation regarding the exams would soon change. After her second year was completed and it was time for exams, Zholia ended up not passing, and because of how poorly she did throughout that year, she was actually not allowed to resit the courses at all. By that point, Zholia was quite limited in options on what she could do to ensure she made it through the program. And so she ended up not only dropping out of the course, but dropping out of university in general. I'm not fully sure exactly when this happened, but assuming that this would have happened shortly after her first degree, it probably occurred sometime around 1993 to 1994. Because it was then in 1995 when Zholia packed up and moved from New Zealand to the United Kingdom. During her first year or so in the UK, Zholia spent her time working as a housekeeper. But while this was the job she was doing, it wasn't the job she intended to keep, because most importantly, during those months she spent working as a housekeeper, she was essentially just stalling for her next job position. And this was to become an active, practicing psychiatrist. Despite failing her exams and not achieving her MBCHB degree, Zholia decided to apply to register with what is called the General Medical Council, or the GMC. And this is the organization responsible for the registration, validation, and general upkeep of the physicians of the UK, so in England, Scotland, Wales, and in Northern Ireland. There was one big problem though. To apply to the GMC, Zholia would have needed to have an MBCHB degree. But because Zholia did not receive her MBCHB degree, nor made it even halfway through the program, she had no position to be applying for the GMC whatsoever. She needed that degree to become certified. But Zholia just really wanted to follow through with her goal of becoming a physician, so she decided she was just going to do what she needed to do to achieve just that. That's why on October 13th, 1995, Zholia actually ended up applying to the GMC. But how did she do this? Well, Zholia actually applied using an MBCHB certificate from the University of Auckland. But this was not a certificate that she earned. No, this was a certificate that Zholia had forged using a forgery kit of tracing papers, pens, and other tools. In this application, not only did Zholia include the forged degree, but she also claimed in her application that she'd worked in a foundation year in Islamabad, Pakistan. So by this point, obviously, there's no way she's going to get in. I mean, one simple check to verify everything, and you'll see that all of this isn't true. But surprisingly, this would actually not be the case. In fact, it would actually be far from it. At the time of her application, the UK had a program referred to as the Commonwealth route for foreign physicians. This route allowed doctors from Commonwealth countries to have their applications fast-tracked through the registration system, making it much easier for doctors from these countries to become doctors in the UK. To explain, Commonwealth countries are countries that were once occupied or ruled by Britain during the British Empire. So essentially what this meant was that Zholia was able to have her application fast-tracked. But a loophole that this also meant was that the usual proficiency exams that were expected of foreign doctors to take were not required. So Zholia was able to apply to become a physician without taking any kind of exam that would show her competency in the material. And despite the odd look of the fake certificate, Zholia's application would actually successfully go through. And with no degree, proficiency, or clinical experience, Zholia Alemi was now a certified paid physician in the UK. This route would be shut down in 2003, just a few years after Zholia was able to take advantage of it. For many, especially her future patients, this would be a complete nightmare. But for Zholia, this was just the beginning of everything she so desperately wanted to achieve. After 1 year of supervised work, Zholia's registration was completed on the 4th of February 1997. And with the registration fully complete, she was now able to work as a doctor in other institutions and trusts throughout the UK without supervision. A large majority of the years of Zholia's work as a doctor are not recorded publicly, as at least at the time, there was no reason for her to be tracked. And somehow, some way, with no actual experience, Zholia was able to function enough in line with what was expected of her to not be clocked as a fraud for over 2 decades. To be exact, a whole 23 years. Within those 23 years, Zholia worked several full-time and locum physician and psychiatry positions. Locum doctors are doctors who are basically substitutes or fill-in for other physicians when they're on leave, both short and long-term. Zholia actually bounced around between hospitals, trusts, and locum agencies throughout the UK, and she actually hit every country at least once. And might I tell you, Zholia was living quite the life. In 2023, it was reported by the Manchester Evening News that in 2001 alone, while working as a doctor in Manchester, Zholia made £67,722 that year. Not only was Zholia blending in, but she seemingly was able to do quite well for herself and kind of make herself a name. Not only did she work all across the UK as a consultant psychiatrist, but she also once specialized in learning disabilities. And eventually, on February 9th, 2017, she was appointed as director of a private firm based in Huddersfield, England, called Healthy Minds and Wellbeing Limited. This after already being appointed as a director of a small web development company called Vervo Limited on January 1st, 2013. In 2003, Zholia was made a member of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, receiving an MRC Psych certification. This exam to achieve the MRC Psych certification consisted of two parts. One, a writing section, and two, a clinical section. And she received this certification as she successfully passed the exam for it. But despite her ability to remain working as a semi-successful physician, there were most definitely other instances of times in which red flags should have been raised regarding her issues with some of her patients. In total, there were 7 formal notes regarding complaints raised against Zholia from 1988 to 2017. In June 1998, a patient complained to those in charge of the Southern Health and Social Care Trust, also known as the Sparran Lakeland Health and Social Care Trust, that Zholia had made inappropriate personal comments to them. It was not listed as to what these comments were, but this complaint was closed in February of 1999 when Zholia denied the claims and not enough evidence could be found to substantiate the patient's claim. The GMC could not restrict Zholia's practice due to it, but she was placed on a supervision and had a few local restrictions placed on her that were not listed. For the most part, the next few years seemed to be quite low-key regarding complaints because it wasn't until about 6 years later when she would receive another one. And this complaint would be one of the main ones that played a significant role later in this case. In September 2004, a family had complained to the heads of the Manchester Mental Health and Social Care Trust about Zholia and her poor behavior regarding a patient with a learning disability. The patient's family claimed that Zholia was adversarial to them, and the family also complained about Zholia's decision regarding a diagnosis and prescription that took place during the patient's residential unit stay. This woman was named Annette Burt, and her case would reveal some shocking actions coming from Zholia, which we'll be getting into full detail a little bit later in the video. Due to the severity of the claims made against Zholia, a full investigation was done on the situation. And with this investigation, there were 2 primary focuses: the poor communication and the inappropriate prescribing. Case examiners from the GMC collected evidence and made final decisions regarding Zholia and her practice. And it was decided that the poor communication didn't meet the threshold to neither restrict her from practicing, remove her registration with the GMC, nor give her a formal warning. While this is where that complaint had concluded, it definitely wasn't the end of Zholia's conduct being questioned at all, because there were some complaints on her behavior towards staff of her inappropriately handling medication and her patients, and her refusing to engage with multidisciplinary teams. They conducted an investigation due to this case, and while I'm sure they expected to find some things possibly regarding similar behavior in the past, they actually found much more than they were probably in for. During the investigation, they found several concerning things regarding Zholia's past that were actually not declared to the GMC. Some of these included traffic violations for careless driving, but they also found that there were several instances of her misrepresenting her prior jobs on her curriculum vitae or CV, misusing her work email, making inappropriate comments to other staff and patients, and not reporting an ongoing GMC case regarding her not having the proper S12 Mental Health Act approval. All of these issues I just mentioned were investigated as individual offenses, as well as together as a whole. And based on the expected standards, they found Zholia's behavior to be unacceptable, and this resulted in her receiving a formal warning. In fact, part of this warning read, quote, "Warning issued. Alemi accepted this warning in July 2012. It was to appear on her public medical register records for 5 years." Now, Zholia was not about all of these complaints being on her name, and so a couple of years later, in September 2012, she requested a review of the previous investigation's outcome. But while she hoped this would help clear her name up a bit, in doing so, she would actually inadvertently spur further investigation that would air out more of her hidden secrets. Because this investigation would now find 3 things. That 1, in December 2011, she didn't disclose a speeding conviction, that in June 2013, there was a complaint from a former co-worker regarding bullying and boundary overstepping with a patient, and 3, they were made aware in January 2014 that Zholia had allegedly assaulted a police officer. In June 2013, Zholia was accused of committing a theft. It was claimed that Zholia had tried taking a copy of a leave form and pharmacy prescription card from St. George's Healthcare Trust in London, England. And it was assumed within the allegation that she was doing this to use it for fraud. However, the letter only states that the issue was investigated, but the matter was closed in December 2013 due to a lack of evidence. So, as a result of these findings, in October 2015, the GMC ended up limiting her in her practice, and these limitations stayed in place until January 25th, 2017. Also, in October 2016, certain allegations were taken before a medical practitioners tribunal. A medical practitioners tribunal, by the way, is essentially a panel or hearing that examines and comes up with a judgment on how to proceed regarding complaints made against doctors or healthcare providers. The tribunals took place between May 2017 and July 2017, and the main allegations that were brought to the tribunal were inaccurate declaration, inappropriate behavior, and also rudeness. Eventually, the tribunal found that these claims were proven, but they did not conclude with a finding of misconduct. Nonetheless, this didn't stop any more theft allegations from coming in. In fact, she would actually get into legal trouble this time. And this incident would actually be the one that would finally expose Zholia's brazen lies. In June 2016, the Cumbria Partnership NHS Trust was made aware that Zholia had been arrested for stealing from a patient's home in Cumbria, England. This patient was named Gillian Belham, and Zholia would soon be looked into after what she did in this case. Gillian Belham was born on August 29, 1931, and she lived a very successful life. Gillian had been a long-time employee as a clerk at the Bank of England in one of their larger London branches, and throughout her years, she had maintained employment consistently. Her husband, Gerald Belham, was also very successful, and with this together, they were able to live a very comfortable life. These early years of Gillian, however, are not the focus of Gillian's part in this case. After her husband, Gerald, had passed away, as a widow with no children, Gillian's health soon began to decline. In February 2016, when Gillian was 84 years old, her loved ones began to suspect that she was showing signs of dementia. Because of this suspicion, her carers put in for her to be evaluated at the dementia clinic of the Wilkinson Community Hospital. This hospital happened to be the same one in which Zholia was working at the time, and Gillian would soon be evaluated by her. At the time of the meeting, Gillian was 84 years old, and according to Zholia's evaluation, she claimed that Gillian was not experiencing symptoms of dementia at all. So while this might be where she would have, ended most contact, it was actually where the contact would start and a friendship would form between the two. From that point out, Zholia kept in contact with Gillian. She would often help out with groceries, and she would be there for Gillian, who came to refer to Zholia as her doctor friend. But while it seemed like this was just a harmless, blossoming friendship, as usual, Zholia's intentions were far from pure. Like mentioned, Gillian was well off, and Zholia just so happened to take notice of Gillian's wealth quite quickly. But rather than being at peace with getting away with one already very bizarre crime of faking being a doctor, Zholia felt the need to push her luck further by abusing the trust of the old woman. Throughout this period, Zholia went on to start this abuse by stealing from Gillian. In fact, 33 valuable watches were stolen by Zholia. It's not sure what her intentions were with them. One can assume it was to sell them, as typically valuables are stolen to be sold, but fortunately all 33 watches would be later found, so if that's what she planned, she did not get around to doing it. Now, 33 valuable watches, that's already a lot. I'm sure you've made your mark, you did what you wanted to do. But for Zholia, again, this wasn't enough. And soon enough, bank cards, documents, and other important paperwork were also taken from Gillian's home without her knowledge. Gillian was also the owner of 2 homes and several other nice valuables that Zholia couldn't yet get her hands on. But in true Zholia fashion, she most definitely had a plan to change that, and her attempts to gain control of Gillian's finances were done in ways one could honestly consider next-level evil. Zholia began by trying to become Gillian's power of attorney. She actually filed the application using the signatures of 2 neighbors as witnesses, as she tricked them into signing the document under the guise of it being a letter to the local council regarding something mundane. And it was after this fraudulent application was sent in when Zholia began rewriting Gillian's will. When forging the fake will, Zholia made both herself and her grandchildren the recipients of Gillian's money and assets. And in doing this, she ended up writing out Gillian's extended family, as well as several charities in which Gillian was planning to leave large chunks of money to. All of this in itself is absurd and would definitely raise red flags. So in order to ease suspicions, Zholia began again taking it to the next level. She ended up making a fake email account set up in Gillian's name. And she did this to create a digital paper trail of communications between her and the fake account to make it seem as if everything was all authorized by Gillian. She sent out several communications back and forth to herself from the accounts to make it seem like she and Gillian were closer than they were. But clearly, she didn't consider in the slightest how digital timestamping works. By that point, Gillian's usual carers became oddly suspicious of Zholia. They started taking notice of the missing watches, and with the worries that Zholia was financially abusing Gillian and taking advantage of the older woman's health and trust, they very quickly acted on a hunch and decided to report Zholia. And her plans would begin to crumble. In June 2016, it was discovered that Zholia was arrested for fraud and theft. The case was brought before a jury at Carlisle Crown Court, and they were shown the evidence of the fraudulent will and Zholia's attempts to get power of attorney over Gillian and her assets. Zholia denied the charges of fraud and theft, and for defense claimed that she had been helping Gillian, managing her finances, and that was the reason why she was rewriting her will. And when asked about Zholia going through her finances and messing with her documentation, Gillian told an officer, quote, "I think she just helped herself." At the end of the 6-day trial on October 18, 2018, Zholia was found guilty of 3 fraud charges, as well as 1 charge of theft, as she was convicted of not just the theft of the 33 watches, but she was also convicted for stealing documents from Gillian's home, attempting to become her power of attorney, and for forging the fake will. And she was subsequently sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, just a few months after the sentencing, on January 11th, 2019, Gillian passed away at the age of 87. But fortunately, when she did, her old will, which is the one she truly wrote, made sure that her money and assets went to the appropriate places. Now, still by that point after the sentencing, to everybody, Zholia was still a licensed physician. But as the news regarding the trial broke, one journalist was left wondering if there was more to the case at all. And this journalist was named Phil Coleman. Phil Coleman is a journalist with News and Star, which is a local tabloid out of Carlisle, Cumbria. And Phil was just deeply unsettled by the idea that a doctor of nearly 20 years could randomly decide one day to start robbing patients. He had an initial hunch that this was not the first time Zholia had done something like this. He suspected that she might have done this before, and because of this, he soon began digging deeper into Zholia's past. Phil began by looking into Zholia's education. He actually contacted the University of Auckland directly to inquire about Zholia's time in university. It took only 3 calls of him asking about her MBCHB degree when Phil was soon shocked to learn that Zholia hadn't graduated with that certificate whatsoever. And this was actually the first time in 20 years that someone other than Zholia would know the truth about her scheme. Phil immediately reported Zholia to both the GMC and to the police. He was just so desperate to make it known to as many ruling bodies as possible that she did not have the formal training in medicine that she claimed to have. The GMC soon began their investigation, and this was shortly followed by the police, who began their investigation after. While the GMC began looking through Zholia's records to attempt to verify her certificates, the police began to get a warrant to search Zholia's home. And not sure on what date, but sometime around this time in October-November 2018, Cumbria police eventually ended up searching Zholia's property as well as her office. And they most definitely found a boatload of startling evidence. During their search, the police discovered several pieces of evidence pointing towards everything Zholia was accused of. And these included tracing papers, transfer tools, several documents, some of which were forged, fake letters or references from people in power, and a blank degree certificate from the University of Auckland, which is assumed to be a practice copy. This investigation was said to have spanned internationally, including information from the United States, New Zealand, Pakistan, and Iran. And it was on November 17th, 2018, when Phil posted an article to News and Star reporting to the world that Zholia Alemi was found to be a fake physician. It was just a couple days later, after posting on November 19th, when other outlets, including large ones like the BBC, were talking about Zholia's fake certificates. And almost 2 years later, in August 2020, Zholia was formally convicted for the charges related to her doctor fraud scheme and was due in the Manchester City Magistrates Court on September 22nd, 2020 to begin the process. Trials subsequently took place in January of 2023. And as the trial and investigation went on, more things about Zholia were beginning to get exposed, and it became known that one of the patients unfortunate enough to have been assigned to Zholia was a woman named Annette Burt, who I'd mentioned earlier as the woman whose family filed a complaint against Zholia in 2004 for her poor behavior. Annette Burt was a woman with various health issues and learning disabilities, but the exact details of these have rightfully been kept private. Many details regarding the entire ordeal are not public, but what is known regarding Annette's experience with Zholia is honestly atrocious. For one, Zholia misdiagnosed Annette, because when coming up with a diagnosis for Annette, Zholia didn't take into account Annette's learning disability. And because of this, the traits or symptoms of her learning disability were mistaken for those of another mental health issue. More specifically, Zholia had misdiagnosed Annette with catatonic schizophrenia, which is one of the 5 subtypes of schizophrenia. And Zholia did not communicate clearly with Annette's family. Her family was not informed of her failing physical health, nor were they consulted at key points in Annette's care. And they were often ignored when raising valid concerns regarding Annette's care and health. Annette would actually pass away in 2014 due to natural causes. No more or less was publicly stated. However, the fallout of Annette's botched care resulted in what's called Annette's Charter, which is a promise by the RDASH NHS Trust that their staff would do better to care for their patients and assure all correct measures are taken to listen to and attend to patients. Though the only 2 mentioned here were Gillian and Annette, they were far from Zholia's only victims. Countless others were likely misdiagnosed, misprescribed, spoken down to, or even wrongfully sectioned by Zholia's carelessness and raw audacity. After the news broke, many went online sharing their unsavory experiences with Zholia, and some have speculated that the unfortunate outcomes of their loved ones were as a result of Zholia's care, or rather lack thereof. For example, there was a man named Darren King. Darren was 31 years old and he was from Suffolk, England. Darren had autism, a history of epilepsy, and learning difficulties. He previously worked as a caretaker at a school, and he lived alone in a flat. Living alone was something his mother described he wanted to do to be more independent. And he was a patient of Zholia's while she worked as a locum psychiatrist at Norfolk and Suffolk NHS Foundation Trust between April 2014 and April 2015. He first saw Zholia as a patient in June 2014. And on April 8, 2017, just 3 years since Zholia had first seen him, Darren was found by his mother unresponsive under the water in his bathtub. He unfortunately was pronounced dead on April 9, 2017 because of this. And after a post-mortem examination, it was concluded that Darren's medical cause of death was drowning as the result of an epileptic fit. Now, although this was the conclusion, Darren's family, however, had reason to believe that his passing could have possibly been prevented if not treated by Zholia. Darren's family were concerned about him doing things like taking a bath, as he sometimes did not take his medications to stop seizures, as he didn't always understand when he had an epileptic fit. And they claimed that Zholia refused the request to do a capacity test to examine the risks of Darren living alone. It was said that because of his autism and increased tactile sensations he had, Darren didn't like the feeling of a shower and preferred to take a bath. But his family was concerned that with the history he had of epilepsy, that it could be a problem if he's taking baths instead of showers. Darren was said to have seen various different psychiatrists throughout the years, and Zholia appeared to be one of them, albeit a fake one during that time. He had only met with Zholia twice. But years later, Darren's father Gavin said that throughout these meetings, Zholia appeared to be a very obnoxious person, and she seemed to be very dismissive of the family's concerns. They felt as though when expressing to Zholia that Darren didn't understand when he had an epileptic fit, that Zholia wasn't engaged in doing any of the requests they asked. She showed no standard care, and she more or less ignored what they were saying. His father said that Darren, quote, needed an assessment around his understanding of his medication along with alcohol and the seizures, which he didn't know he was having. We wanted the bath removed. But unfortunately, this bath would go without being removed, and Darren would unfortunately pass away in it after drowning. While the family fully acknowledged that it is fully possible that Darren could have possibly passed away from a seizure, they said that if the requests were made and they were listened to with having the bath removed, he wouldn't have drowned. But after an inquest was held in February of 2019, a qualified psychiatrist named Dr. Jonathan Burt said that based on the evidence, in his opinion, that he, quote, felt that Ms. Alemi's management and treatment of Mr. King was very reasonable, with another expert witness, coroner Nigel Parsley, saying, quote, he could not identify an act or omission that led directly to Darren's death in relation to Ms. Alemi's treatment. As a grieving family finding out that one of the doctors who treated their now deceased son was a fake, it's 100% reasonable to think that that could have played a tremendous role. And when you look at the additional things it was found that she might have done to patients, it can only make you wonder what was happening behind closed doors throughout those years, especially after some things were alleged to have happened during Zholia's time working in Scotland. In an article posted on May 18, 2019 by The Herald, it was said that during her time as a fake doctor, that Zholia allegedly might have given patients unnecessary and quite harsh treatments. In fact, it was suspected that she allegedly gave patients electroshock therapy. Electroshock therapy, which is now known as electro-convulsive therapy, is a type of psychiatric treatment in which a brief electrical current is induced in one's brain while under anesthesia to cause short seizures and in turn treat various mental health issues, including major depression or bipolar disorder. This alone, you're working with electrical currents and anesthesia. This is something that a doctor needs to be prescribing to someone. The thought of a person with no medical training saying, oh yeah, we're gonna do some electroshock therapy on you, is terrifying. For around 18 months in 2007, Zholia was employed as a locum at the Ayrshire and Arran NHS Trust in Scotland. And during that time, she saw 395 general patients. 24 of those patients were actually detained by her under the Mental Health Act. And it's not known how many, as the Scottish government didn't confirm the number of patients affected, but based on the allegations, it can be assumed that some of these patients must have it noted in their charts that they received electroconvulsive therapy under her care. And while this was bad enough, it wasn't just this that she did. But during her time in Scotland, Zholia had actually been responsible for the fate of a lot of patients' care as she sat as a medical member on a mental health tribunal. A mental health tribunal is essentially a panel or hearing that makes the decisions on how things should proceed for one's treatment. This panel should consist of a legally qualified tribunal judge, a specialist with mental health expertise, and a licensed psychiatrist. And somehow, Zholia was able to become a psychiatrist on this tribunal. In fact, after a Freedom of Information request was made by the Herald in November 2018, the Mental Health Tribunal for Scotland revealed that Zholia had sat on 89 hearings from 2008 to 2013. Although it was stated that, quote, all official decisions she contributed to would have been reviewed by further tribunals due to the amount of time passed, and any patients affected by her input would have been discharged from care and treatment. This nonetheless is concerning, knowing the role she would have played in the outcome for these patients' care in doing this. And it wasn't just patients who had accounts of Zholia's strange behavior, but also some of her own colleagues had their own statements to say. From 2014 to 2015, a woman named Claire Wilkinson worked as a personal assistant under Zholia when she was a locum consultant at the Westbourne unit in Beacon Park Road, Plymouth. She stated that during her time working with Zholia, she tried on multiple occasions to blow the whistle on her and report Zholia's strange behavior to the higher-ups. She claimed to have brought it up to the line manager and even a senior employee, yet none of her attempts were treated seriously. Claire claimed that throughout that short time spent working with Zholia, Zholia was very money-driven. In fact, Claire stated that Zholia allegedly was living in her car at the time, and Claire stated that Zholia, quote, would only find the wealthy men attractive even if they weren't attractive. She went for wealth and hierarchy. This wasn't the only strange thing Claire witnessed while working with Zholia. For example, Claire stated that there was a young girl who was having problems at home and came in to see Zholia. But instead of finding a decent solution, Zholia allegedly refused prescriptions for the girl and offered her electroconvulsive therapy instead. Not only this, but Claire's first encounters with Zholia were bizarre in itself. Claire claimed that the first thing Zholia asked her when they met were if her eyelashes were real. And as a Christmas present, Zholia allegedly bought Claire an engagement ring despite there being no romantic relationship between the two whatsoever. Also, in addition to this, Claire said that while doing private work for Zholia, Zholia apparently made up this story about a consultant being treated badly and living in bad conditions with boarded up windows and whatnot. And Zholia apparently said that she had bought her own church for this consultant to live in. But in reality, this person didn't exist, and the consultant Zholia was apparently referring to was herself. I don't know, it's confusing. But all in all, Claire ended up quitting her profession on medical grounds, and she blamed the deterioration in her own health in part to the things she witnessed because of Zholia, stating that, quote, Zholia made her feel sick. It had such an effect on her emotionally. And what's interesting is that this kind of behavior was also said to not only have come from Zholia in a work setting, but also in her neighborhood as well. In early 2016, Zholia moved into a semi-detached house in High Harrington, Cumbria. Now, kind of similar to how Claire described her living in her car, when Zholia moved to High Harrington, she also didn't have anything on her. No furniture, nothing. Near her house was one of her neighbors, a woman named Mel Moon. And after introducing herself, Zholia told Mel all about how she was waiting for her furniture to arrive and how she didn't have anything at the time. Because Mel saw that Zholia had nothing with her, she and her partner gave Zholia a camping chair and an airbed to borrow as she waited for her furniture to arrive. And Zholia took down her new neighbors' phone numbers so she could stay in contact with them. Only a few days went by after this initial meeting when Zholia was apparently up to what now could be described as her typical behavior. Because she began talking to Mel, and she told Mel, like, hey, there's this US-based trading firm I know of. You guys have done me a great favor. I want to return the same to you. I think you should really consider investing in this firm. She initially suggested that Mel and her partner begin by investing £300. But it didn't take long when she changed that number, saying that they should invest £3,000. And she told them, like, hey, if you invest £3,000 or whatever amount, I'll make sure to double the amount of money you put into the company. Now, Mel and her partner were quite suspicious about this. They thought it was a bit strange and kind of sounded like a scam. So they told her, like, oh, cool, thanks. We'll think about it. And they showed her no interest in this company whatsoever. But despite the lack of interest they had, Zholia still continuously asked them if they could invest in the company. For a week, she repeatedly sent them text messages to invest in this firm. She even invited them to her new home and offered to cook some kind of traditional Iranian dish so that they could discuss the opportunity over dinner. But obviously, using their discernment, they didn't go through with investing anything. Now, what on earth was this company and why did Zholia want her neighbors to invest in it? Well, remember how I mentioned earlier that Zholia was a director of 2 different companies? Well, like stated, one of these companies was called Vervo Limited. She was appointed as director of this company on January 1st, 2013. And while this company was based in Harrow, England, there were 3 other individuals who were working alongside Zholia in this company. One was a doctor based in New Zealand, and there were 2 individuals, a director and secretary based in Nevada. So, considering she was advertising a company in the States, one can assume that this was the company that she was mentioning. Even though Zholia was trying to get her neighbors to invest in this company, advertising it as a trading firm, this company in particular is described on one of the colleagues' LinkedIn as a, quote, a small web development company. And it appears to have no trading purposes whatsoever. Plus, this company was later dissolved in January 2017, so who's to say what her intention was with whatever she was doing? And like mentioned from her previous assistant, her neighbors also described that Zholia took a liking to wealth and luxury, as Mel cited that she recalled Zholia arriving in a red Lotus Elise with a personalized number plate. And this is a car that can cost up to around £30,000. Throughout her time as a fake physician, Zholia had ended up earning up to £1.3 million in wages from the NHS. And as a result of her deception, the GMC stated that they would be completing urgent checks on 3,000 foreign doctors based in the UK following this case. After 4 weeks of trial, on Wednesday, February 15, 2023, Zholia was found guilty of 21 charges. And these included 13 counts of fraud, 3 counts of obtaining a pecuniary advantage by deception, 2 counts of forgery, and 3 counts of using a false instrument, which false instrument in this case means using faked documents. On the day of her guilty verdict, Zholia was informed by Judge Hilary Manley that the sentencing, which would take place a few days later on February 28th, would be, quote, of some substantial length. And once that day came on February 28th, Zholia was officially sentenced to 7 years in prison for the combined 20 plus charges. I'm unsure whether or not those 7 years were meant to be served in addition to her previous 5 for stealing from Gillian, or if it was alongside the previous 5. It wasn't stated in any of the media articles, but nonetheless, at the very least, she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Now, this case, all in all, is just so bizarre. It's honestly just ridiculous how far Zholia pushed to do what she was doing. She was already able to successfully figure out a loophole to get the title she wanted as a doctor. But that wasn't even enough for her. No, she wanted more. She wanted watches, she wanted money. She was just so engulfed in this greed, she didn't stop to think, maybe I should take a step back or this might look a little sus. Thankfully, she was very greedy though, because otherwise, who's to say how long she would have been able to continue this. I'm glad at the very least, Gillian's will was corrected back to what it initially was. It just is unfortunate that she thought she had someone who she trusted who cared about her, when in reality, Zholia had horrible motives. It's just chilling to think what could have happened had Zholia actually received power of attorney over Gillian. And it's terrifying to think that if Phil Coleman, the journalist who reported on Zholia, had not taken that extra step to investigate everything, that Zolia's larger scheme may have gone unnoticed. Hopefully the GMC, NHS, and just any medical board of sorts doesn't have any kind of error or loophole that would allow something like this to happen again. Hopefully Gillian's resting easy with her husband, knowing that the woman who attempted to defraud her was stopped and punished before she could do so. Hopefully all the patients and victims affected can heal from this and not have altered trust in medical professionals after dealing with something like this, because it definitely would be hard to trust after finding out your physician's a fake. And with Zholia now in prison, hopefully she will serve the entirety of her sentence for what she did. And not just that, but I hope she really just takes the time to reflect on her actions and think about just why she would go so far to do such crimes. But yes, that is it for today's case. What are your thoughts on this absurd case? Please comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.